Welcome back. So in this video, I'm going to do a part 2 on the buy, borrow, die framework. So how do you repay the loan? This is one of the biggest objections people have on the buy, borrow, die strategy. And I'm going to just simplify how to actually do the strategy correctly, because there is so many accountants and other financial creators that talk about the strategy, but they fundamentally don't understand the strategy. They don't teach it correctly, and they don't explain why we even do the strategy in the first place. So I'm going to break it down in the most simple, easy way possible. Okay, so why do we even do the strategy in the first place? Why do we even have debt? Why not just pay off all the debts and have cash and live happily ever after? Well, the only reason we actually do the strategy is because there is a sovereign national debt crisis in the USA and in European nations as well, like UK, France, and most of Europe, to be honest. Pretty much spending more than the country makes. So the only real solution to the problem, because a country can't really go bankrupt, it just hyperinflates, which destroys people that are wage earners and savers. They will get absolutely vaporized. And the best way to look at it is we just look at history. We look at what happened to Germany. So remember Germany, they hyperinflated. Their plan was win World War I, and with the spoils, they'll fix all the problems with the debt. But obviously they lost and their currency became worthless. So a loaf of bread ended up costing 160 marks. At the end of 1922, it cost 200 billion marks. Workers were often paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before prices rose again during their lunch break. They used wheelbarrows of wagons to carry massive stacks of cash. Okay, so this is an example of how a country goes bankrupt. They just print money to infinity and the money effectively becomes worthless. This is happening, but it's happening so slow that people don't notice it. People just are asking, like, why is everything so expensive? Why do we always feel like we're broke all the time? This is exactly the reason why. It's the debt crisis. People are just don't realise they're actually just on a treadmill that they cannot get off unless they understand how to defeat the enemy. And the enemy is the money supply, which I talk about all the time on the channel. So in order to do buy, borrow, die, you have to understand this first. The only reason we do it is because the person that survives hyperinflation is someone who owns assets, like Hugo Stein's. So he was a man in Germany during the hyperinflation, and he just decided, okay, I'm going to take a bunch of debt and buy things that actually matter, like factories and mines, because he realised that the currency was near enough worthless by this point. So he benefited from it because he held the assets, whereas someone's life savings was vaporized. Because as you can see here, a loaf of bread ended up costing 200 billion marks. But the pro to that is they were able, with less than a day's wages, they could pay off their mortgage. So it applies to debt. The debt becomes worthless as well. And that is why investors use the strategy, because if you have an asset that appreciates fast enough and the loan is cheaper than inflation, you can use the strategy. So here's an example of the correct way to do the strategy, and I'll show you the wrong way as well. So this is really simple. 1 million, say a $1 million portfolio, and notice it's a 20% loan to value. That's a 200 grand loan against $1 million of asset value. Now I say 20% because that protects you from a margin call. Yeah, so we need the growth to outperform the money supply and the cost of the loan. So in this example, it's a 15% return. Okay, we need the growth to make the strategy work. This is where most people get the strategy wrong. When you listen to accountants all over YouTube who think it's like, they sell it like it's a hack. They say things like Jeff Bezos does this, or here, this is what the rich do. They borrow against their stock and they don't pay tax. So let's just copy them. And what they end up doing is borrowing against their index funds, their S&P 500. But unfortunately, the S&P 500 doesn't grow fast enough to outperform both the cost of the loan and inflation. So we need at least a 15% growth. We need the loan to be cheaper than 7%. And there is plenty of institutional brokers that offer cheap debt. I'm not going to tell you, I can't advise you who, but they're out there. And if you look for them, you can see them. Anyway, back to the spreadsheet. So what you notice here is after 10 years, the portfolio grows to 3.5 million. The debt also grows, but because of inflation, the loan to value 10%. And if I've put in here this M2 purchasing power, that was the cost, that was your hurdle rate. So to keep $1 million of purchasing power, in 10 years, you need to have that turned into 1.7, right? The point is, to keep it very simple, you need the growth. So we need 15%. So I don't know, you need to look at the stock movement is different to the actual performance of the business. So the way I like to look at it is, if the business is growing free cash flow year after year at 15% year over year growth, that would qualify as an asset that's outperforming. Even if the stock price stayed flat, if the stock price was flat for 12 months, but the business was actually growing, that would still count as an outperformer. The stock price just hasn't caught up yet, but the stock price will inevitably catch up because the business is producing. So that's if you're using single stocks. If you're looking at a passive way of doing it, it's very difficult to do this passively. The only ETF that I looked at, obviously, is the Nasdaq 100. Because look, last year it did 40%, so it's vastly outperformed. Okay, these are the best tech companies in America and the world, and over the last 5 years, it's averaged at like 20%. So that would qualify. What happens if someone tries to copy the strategy using the S&P? Well, they lose, over 10 years, they lose 310,000 of purchasing power, because you cannot get a 7% return, inflation 7%, then you're paying the loan. So these people that do the passive strategy are actually bleeding purchasing power. This is the wrong way to do strategy. Okay, this is someone who's listened to like an accountant who says, yeah, this is what the wealthy do. Just borrow against, because they don't, their hurdle rate is not the money supply. They use CPI inflation. CPI inflation is the cost of survival. Milk, bread, eggs, and iPads, that's the cost, not the cost of assets. Okay? Right. Look at 1959, what you could buy for 100 grand. In 1959, for 100 grand, you could buy 45 brand new cars, 26 years of human labour, and 5.2 single family homes. Okay, so people ask themselves, well, why did things go up? They just think it's supply and demand or it's inflation, but they don't really know what that means. The point is, the truth, the textbook view on inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. That's the technical definition. But when you dig deep enough, you start to realise actually it's simpler than that. It's just too much money. If there's too much money, that is inflation. That's your share of the earth. So we look at it, okay, this is dollars. There's $22 trillion floating around. That's what M2 is. 1959, there was 286 billion. That was all the money. 286 billion. Right now, there's people worth more than that. But there wasn't even that much money in 1959. You see, if the money supply was fixed, imagine it stayed at $286 billion and there was never a dollar more printed or created. Technically, asset prices would be fixed because the money supply is not growing. So there's only so much money. It's like a fixed set pie. So it's the reason assets can continue to go up and the reason stocks can continue to go up because more money gets created. So when you're doing the buy, borrow, die strategy, if you want to do it, you need to use a taxable broker that allows margin. In America, the strategy is completely different to the UK. So if you're a UK watching this, the strategy is completely different. You cannot just borrow margin like in America. Americans can do the strategy completely different. So the choice of paying the loan is really up to the investor, because technically if your asset is just continuing to perform, you might actually just not pay the loan. You might just carry that all the way to death. However, if you do need to sell the asset because the asset might have lost its pricing power, lost its moat, lost its monopoly, has to have genuinely lost its pricing power. It can't just be like a crash. It's crashed 20% and you panic and sell it. That doesn't count. That's just emotional selling. If the actual asset business is now gone, and you're 100% certain of that, and you've lost conviction entirely in the business, then it's better to just pay capital gains tax. Sometimes people would do this strategy where they're losing the money to spite the IRS or HMRC, when in actual fact, if they just sold the asset, paid capital gains tax, they would have been better off. The point of the strategy is you need to genuinely be a good investor first before you can do the strategy. It's not for everyone. That is what's important to understand. The asset is more important than the strategy, because the asset is the most important part. Okay, you've got that. In America, USA, they have one of the greatest tax codes is the step-up basis. So at death, if depending on your net worth, I believe it did change at the beginning of this year, something around. I will double check it, but the point being is, your whoever your next of kin is, your children, they will get your assets and they can sell them without paying capital gains tax. Step up in basis, and they can just sell some assets and pay off all the debt if they want. Or if they're well educated in the strategy, they might want to just carry the strategy on. So that's also an option. But then it starts to get a bit more complicated if we want to look at trust structuring and setting up like an irrevocable trust. That's a whole different ballgame. That's more like asset protection and building a dynasty. This is how the billionaires in family offices build a dynasty. They use this strategy. But the most important thing is the education to the children. If the children understand the strategy, they can just carry it on and use it. So the loan as well, dividends can also slightly offset it. So you have depending on what type of stocks you're invested in. Usually a high growth stock that's growing at like 15% a year, these companies tend not to pay a massive dividend. But that doesn't bother me. Even if you're getting like 0.5%, like look at Microsoft, for example. Microsoft's like it was nearly 1%. Because remember the rule, never ask a genius for a dividend. And what will happen is the dividend will chip away at the margin loan slightly. It's not going to pay it off, obviously, but it will chip away at it. You can just look at it as reducing the the cost of the loan, or it just offsets it, and you can draw that money back out if you want. The idea as well, when you're actually wanting to borrow for lifestyle, I did this in another video, you want the assets need to reach escape velocity first. Once escape velocity is reached, and the asset is actually compounding faster than you can even pay into it, that can happen sooner than you think, depending on what asset you're invested in, obviously the performance of your asset. But once escape velocity is reached, usually around 2 million. 2 million is usually where that is happening. And that's when I would say borrowing for lifestyle can be achieved at that point. So look here. So let's say year 6, right? Look at this spreadsheet. Year 6, the assets, the portfolio is worth 2 million. The loan's 280. So we've got a 13% loan to value, right? We'll call it 14%. So if you want to be really conservative, you can borrow, bring that up by 6% to bring it up to 20% loan to value. So you're drawing that money back out. And it brings it back up to 20%. You're taking out. I'm doing this very conservatively. It's 20%. I have occasionally went to 30% if I'm funding and buying more stock. But in the investing world, 20% is viewed as very conservative. Yeah, 20% loan to value, I'm calling that. Okay. So, rule 1, learn investing. As far as getting your entry valuation, that's what's probably the most important aspect. Paying a fair valuation for whatever the asset is you're investing. The strategy doesn't really work with property unless your property is in a prime location, central London, Mayfair, Manhattan, New York, Monaco, an area that is you can't create and you can't build any more houses on it. Highly sought after areas, Miami Beach. There's only like 5% of properties in the world that actually outperform the money supply. Most of the properties just follow the money supply. So with property, it's more difficult to do the strategy. But I hope that is useful for you. This is just to give you an idea of the strategy. But I hope you enjoyed.